Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster 2, and welcome to this model railway that I'll be building today. This is ironically the smallest build I've ever done in Planet Coaster, but also probably one of the biggest builds I've done in terms of the amount of effort that went into making this possible. But that's also why I'm super hyped to share this video with you guys today and take you through the sometimes very fun and clunky and unpredictable process of trying to put this thing together and animate the whole thing. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing that I started off with was a bit of preparation that you just saw for just about a second, I think, which is to figure out which pieces in the game you can scale down to the smallest size imaginable. There are some pieces that you can scale down to 10%, like some of the pine tree pieces for instance, or some specific steel beams from the aquatic set. And then there are also some pieces that you can only scale to 20 or 50%, but that are pretty small of themselves already. So I put all of those together in one group just to get an idea of what I could build with these pieces. And eventually I realized, combined with the fact that we can animate things and attach scenery to roller coasters, we can probably do miniatures in this game, including model railways, and that's kind of where this whole idea came from. So I started off with the railways themselves and putting together some rails using the small aquatic beams. So technically all of these pieces are made out of metal, but given the fact that the scale is so small, you probably don't notice that the wooden planks looking things are actually just metal beams, and everything kind of comes together. So I made some custom railway pieces using these aquatic pieces, and then built a wooden coaster and tried to follow the path of the railway pieces and vice versa to make sure that these railways are always exactly in the middle of the wooden coaster track, so that I could attach some scenery to the coaster and then sink the coaster down into the ground and move the scenery up so that it looks like our little scenery train, which is attached to the wooden coaster car, is actually coasting on these miniature rails instead of, well, being a detached part of the wooden coaster. Now, I specifically chose the wooden coaster for this because I need the pieces to be as long as the coaster car that they are based on, because otherwise the rotation is going to look very wonky, and the wooden coaster is just perfect for it because it has this very small zero car that has just about the size of my miniature locomotive here. So that's going to be my first part of this train. And then all of the wagons behind this can be a bit longer, and that matches just about with the length of the coaster cars here. So that eventually, if I have my wagons in place, it's gonna move in a decently realistic way, and I can even make the train longer and shorter just by making the wooden coaster longer and shorter. So that's my whole plan of going at this thing, and I did run a couple test runs to see how this would work at certain scales. And eventually this is what I ended up with and what I ended up going for. So this locomotive is mostly made out of some metal beam pieces, which you can scale down to 10%, which makes them super useful. And to be very honest, I also don't think that it was intended by Frontier to make these things scalable to 10%, because this really only accounts for a couple objects in the game, and it seems a little bit random as well, like the pine trees or the spruces, I believe they are, being able to be downscaled to 10%. So I was debating being a bit more quiet about this before they patch this out or something like that. But as it stands right now, I hope nothing's gonna happen to the scalability of these pieces, because they are so good for making miniatures like this, but also just any kind of detailing. So I had to make a couple of concessions with the locomotive there. It's mostly made out of the round metal beams, which works fine for most things, but I couldn't get a wheel piece that was small enough to make realistic wheels. So instead we just have a couple cylinders at the bottom of the locomotive to act as the wheels. Not the most realistic thing, but I think that from a distance it looks decent enough, so I'm willing to go for it. And then for the wagons behind this, we're following the length of the coaster car, and just putting some windows in there to make it look like a real small wagon. And also I'm putting the Deutsche Bahn logo on there, being a bit cheeky about that one, just to make it seem like we're actually based on a real-life German train design here, which it loosely is, because for my inspiration for these pieces I went to the Märklin website, which is one of the most popular model railway companies in real life. They're from Germany and they're pretty big around these parts when it comes to any kind of model railway. And they have some starter sets, which include really nice wagons and locomotives that work just perfectly for this kind of thing, I think. So that's what these pieces are mostly modeled after. They're standard starter set with a black locomotive and green wagons that you can combine and put on your railroads and make them functional as well. And yeah, I think that's overall a pretty good inspiration and also not too difficult to pull off in the game as well. And that's basically it for making these objects. And at this point, all I had to do was make sure that I put the coaster down in the ground. So now you can see we just have the train on the rails, and that's about it. I did cut some of this footage out because it was very finicky trying to get these trains to stay on the rails exactly. It took a lot of trial and error because every small difference in placement of the wooden track of course results in a huge displacement of this locomotive on its miniature rails. So it was a bit finicky, but eventually we got there and we have a very simple layout. I didn't want to go too over the top on this, and it's just a couple curves and 2 stations, and I'm gonna spend the rest of this video theming it. Now initially I had the idea to make the grass in this miniature build out of moss pieces and then use rockwork to create elevation differences and shape the mountains, which wasn't too bad of an idea. I think it could work. But eventually I realized that it's also just way too finicky, especially trying to make hills and such. But I did start out with this, and I do keep some of the moss around, at least for the sand texture underneath the railways. But do know that the rest of the grass is still subject to change, because it's just a bit too hard to work with. Even though that texture is so good, I'm such a big fan of the moss texture, which is especially useful now that we can reshape things or reskill things, and you can use it for more than just moss. And even as just moss, it's super useful, but really use that thing to add texture to your walls or whatever it is that you want to add texture to. It's a great piece. And in this case, it works alright as grass as well, but definitely for the sandy texture underneath the railways, I think it's just the right fit. But that's when I realized that if I want to have some sort of grass texture in this build, I should just use the mossy rocks, because they're just about perfect for the job. So I've placed one of them down already, and it must be something subconscious in my mind while I'm building the rest of this going, that might actually be better than the moss pieces to do grass with. So eventually I switched to those things and putting them all over the railroad, which was a bit of work as well, because obviously these rock pieces aren't flat at the top and the rails are, so I really had to figure out which parts of these rock pieces are at least flat enough that if you put a couple of them together and also a couple different rocks, so everything doesn't start to look too much the same, you get a good layer to support the rails. But eventually we got there, and we even have some nice rock work that we can shape out some of the mountains with. Because for the theme of this thing, which you've already seen at the start of this video, I'm going for something more or less standard for model railways around these parts. It's inspired by German landscapes in Bavaria around the Alps or so, with some typical alpine houses and timber framed houses, lots of rockwork and grass and pine trees, and just the overall atmosphere of, I think, many different railroad sets. And, I should say, I recently visited Miniatur Wunderland in Hamburg, Germany, which is supposedly the biggest model railway in the world, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, and I'm willing to believe it. It's absolutely huge, and it's absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorite day trips that I've done in a long time. They have many different themes, among them a fictional German town called Knuffingen, but also Switzerland and Monaco and much more. And each part is huge. You can spend a lot of time looking at each part of that whole miniature world. And the amount of detail is absolutely insane. There are obviously model railways going all around these parts, and that was part of the inspiration for this build. But they also have functioning cars and trucks, which even have turn signals and functioning crossings where the traffic lights will go from red to green, and then all of the cars with their turn signals will go into the correct direction. Absolutely insane. I think the highlight and something that goes viral on the internet every now and then is Knuffingen Airport, where they have a functional airport somehow with planes that actually land and fly away from the runways. They hook up to the buildings and actually also appear on the departures and arrivals boards, and then cars and trucks arrive to load the baggage and everything. It's insane. I think I even saw the Millennium Falcon arrive from Star Wars on the runway, and then it showed up on the arrivals board as well. So it's absolutely amazing, and I highly recommend anyone, if you're ever in the area, definitely visit Miniatur Wunderland. It's in a beautiful part of Hamburg as well. And yeah, looking at that thing, I think it just got stuck in my mind somewhere. And once we got Planet Coaster 2 and I realized we can rescale things and we can attach items to coasters, and they don't even have to be strictly attached to the coasters, but they could be somewhere else in the map as well. One of the first things that I wanted to try is something like this. So I am already happy that it even works out remotely well, but overall I'm actually happy with this build in general. Now, moving on, I'm doing more rock work on this side and really using these rocks to create the grassy textures, which I think work pretty well too, because it's supposed to be a moss texture, and very often moss textures just work as very small grass textures, so I think they work on the scale of this build as well. And then with the moss texture as a dirt/sandy texture right underneath the rails, I think it overall creates a pretty realistic look. That doesn't look entirely realistic, but definitely looks like a miniature railway. So there's that. Also, I added some extra tracks on the top here as a sort of extra line that you could theoretically have some trains go over, but of course in game I don't have a coaster hooked up to this part, so it's mostly just theming here. Also, I really had to watch out with these rails because I am still trying to fit this thing on a blueprint, because I think it's actually a really cool thing to be able to have this and put it in a park somewhere. I know Epcot, for instance, in Disney World has a pavilion for Germany on the World Showcase part of the park, which has a miniature railway as well. And the Efteling also has an attraction called Diorama, which is an indoor miniature railway and diorama showcase. So as a theme park attraction, I think it actually kind of works to have a little model railway to look at. And to actually share it, I had to make sure that this thing was blueprintable, which means getting it under 4,000 pieces, which is quite difficult considering the fact that the rails alone are made out of so many pieces, because every single beam and every curve is made out of separate pieces. So of all things, I really had to be most careful with the amount of rails that I put in this build, which is part of the reason why the layout is so simple. If I made this any more complex, it would very quickly turn into thousands of pieces, which I wouldn't be able to do much about. Plus, I still want to do quite a bit of theming still, so I have to watch out with how many pieces I use for these rails, because every building, and they're gonna be small, but they're still gonna need lots of pieces, because every beam and every roof piece on those buildings, no matter how small they are, is still gonna count for the piece count. So yeah, I'm gonna have to be very conservative with it here, even from the start of this build. That said, we really needed to get some basic rails in, as well as that extra rail just to make it believable that this is a miniature railway. Plus, I wanted to have stations with 2 rails as well, so a lot of extra pieces go into that too. Now my extra rail line here is also an excuse to build a small bridge, which I think fits into the landscape quite well, and also probably my secret route into the middle of this build. Now, in my headcanon, there is a space underneath this miniature build with all kinds of mechanics and stuff, and also a part that the railway goes into over here. So there's going to be a cave in the mountain in the near future, which the train can go into, where they can go into maintenance or be taken on or off the tracks. But that's just some of my headcanon for this build and whatever kind of real-life mechanics it would have behind it, because in the game, the only hidden mechanics here are a wooden coaster somewhere very deep underground, which is very slowly making its way around a completely nonsensical layout. Now, this is where I started building some buildings, and you can probably tell that this is my first building because I wasn't being conservative enough with the amount of pieces that I was using yet. I still used so many wooden beams on this thing, thinking that I could make a whole village like this, which, spoiler alert, is not going to be possible. This is too many pieces for a single building. Eventually, I think this building turns into around 80 pieces or so, which doesn't sound too horrible. But if I want to have a whole village, then 12 of these buildings would already be almost 1/4 of my maximum piece count, so I can't be too careful with this. This is also why I started out with this custom miniature roof texture, which I think works out pretty well. It's a brick building piece that for some reason can be scaled down to 10%. It's the 1 meter painted bricks for your knowledge, if you wanted to know, which it can be super small. So that's a very useful piece for detailing, and I think it even works pretty decently for a very small tiled roof like this. But this is again too much for my piece count, so eventually I think I ended up taking this piece away, which is a bit of a shame, but you know, you have to do what you have to do, and I have to make these buildings a little bit more simple. So here's my second building, which is already a bit more simple, really trying to build these buildings with as few pieces as I can. So I am scaling up and down this 1 meter brick piece a few times to get the right shape of the building. And when it comes to doing these wooden planks, I'm also making them a little bit larger than would be realistic for a roof like this, just to make sure that I don't have to use too many of these wooden pieces, because they too add up pretty quickly. And then there's just our simple trim, and our door is a scaled up plank with a very small post. At least the benefit of a build like this is that you are looking at very small buildings, so you don't notice the detail too much. And I think it's even realistic to keep these buildings a little bit less detailed, because that's probably how it would be in real life as well. So that's it for my first few test buildings, and at this point I decided it's time to work on our station building, or at least the first of 2 station buildings, but this is the only station that's going to be actually fancy. And funnily enough, I built it above the wooden coaster station, and looking back at this, I really must have thought that this was the main station, like I really had to dress this thing up, which kind of makes no sense. It doesn't matter if it's this part or the other part where I built the fancy station. There's just something about the fact that this is, for the wooden coaster, which is actually underneath it, the actual station, so I decided to build the fancy station here. So I'm starting off with, again, a scaled up wall to be able to build the platforms with as few pieces as I could, adding some dirt around the tracks to finish that all up, and bringing back the brick wall painted 1 meter, because that is truly the goat of all pieces when you're doing miniature stuff like this and detailing. And then also some plaster walls to create what kind of resembles an asphalt road. I didn't want to work with roads too much because that quickly would turn into a piece fest just like the rails, Not to mention that I don't have any small cars or buses to put on these things. I guess I could have made one on a coaster, for instance, or out of miniature pieces, but that would quickly add to the piece count as well. So everything else here is pretty simple and minimalistic, but I still wanted to have some kind of road to at least make it a tiny bit believable that there would be a station here and that you could actually reach this station by other means than a train. That's, by the way, where you saw me try to play some cars for a few seconds, trying to figure out if there was maybe something that I could place here, but unfortunately there really isn't anything. So I went to the cover of the platform, which is made out of scaled up wooden pieces, so that whole platform cover is just 6 pieces. Gosh, this whole time I was constantly calculating how many pieces am I using for this, how many pieces do I have left, and what else can we do? So everything really is much more economical than I am used to building. But I think that's also part of what made this build so much fun. Besides just trying to come up with what it should look like, it was always a bit of a puzzle to try and figure out how I could build things with very few pieces. And then on the side here we have what kind of looks like a wooden building, which is what it is, but I had to scale down some wooden plank pieces to make it look like we have walls made out of multiple small planks here. In any regular situation, I probably would have made these walls out of separate planks myself to make the texture a bit more realistic, but in this case, we really have to go minimalistic. These windows, by the way, are made out of rain gutters, which I quickly realized are some of the smallest pieces in the game in general. You don't even have to scale them down that much, and sometimes I even had to scale them up. But the backside of a rain gutter ending piece is a very nice small rectangle that works great for windows and little details. So that's that on the side. And then in the middle we have the fancy part of the station building, which gets some timber framing and gets to be a little bit taller. It's also too big. Looking at this footage right now, I can't believe that I didn't see this while I was building this, but this thing is absolutely huge. It doesn't really match the scale of the coaster train, so please be aware that I rescaled this building a little bit off camera as well later on. I don't think it's anytime soon, but eventually when we're looking at the end results, this building should be scaled down a little bit. It's still a tiny bit too big, because I simply couldn't scale it down more, but it's a bit more realistic than what it is right now. You know, if you compare the size of the train and the building right now, it is a little bit off. That said, the scale on this thing in general is a tiny bit off. To be very honest, I don't know what scale I'm using exactly here. The scale is just based on what is technically, realistically feasible with the wooden coaster underneath this whole thing, and also the amount of which we can scale down these pieces. But the scale is even a little bit inconsistent throughout this build. My main goal was just to make it look believable and get a scale which is kind of similar to outdoor miniature things. So not necessarily an indoor model railway, but something like the railways in Legoland or Madurodam in the Netherlands, or any kind of outdoor model railway / miniature world, which you find in many places around the world. Really, Madurodam is just my reference as a Dutch person, but I've seen quite a few of these in just about any place. Ooh, and I want to draw your attention to these streetlights as well. They might not be the perfect streetlights. They're not very street lighty, but they definitely look like lights, and they're definitely very small. And I think they're based more on the small garden lamps that you sometimes see next to paths, so I think that's why they're in the game. But they work perfectly for a small miniature streetlight as well, I think, so pretty happy with how those things turn out. Now, this is where I tried making the mountain out of the rock pieces, and I'm mostly using the very large rocks, ironically enough, because, well, I don't even have to scale them down that much, but I really wanted to use as few rock pieces as I could here. And some of the large rock pieces have lots of different parts of moss and slopes. So all things considered, I think there's quite a bit of grass on this build. I was really afraid that making this thing out of rocks entirely would make it too much rock, really. But the amount of green texture that we can still get in here and realistically make it look like an alpine field and meadow is actually quite nice. So yeah, big fan of that. By the way, this is probably a good place to say that in my headcanon, this build is called Jägeralm, and our train is called the Jägeralm Express, which is named after a coaster that I did in Planet Coaster 1 called Jägerhorn. And really, Jägerhorn was always a roller coaster inspired by model railways. That's why it has lots of grass and rocks and a German alpine theme. I just wondered what a mine train coaster inspired by the looks of a model railway would look like. So the fact that after all these years the theme is coming back to an actual model railway in Planet Coaster 1 is actually kind of a dream come true. And I am harking back to a lot of my inspiration for Jägerhorn at the time. So yeah, it's kind of nostalgic in that sense. Also, here's where I did some foliage, and I still don't know why these trees can be scaled down to 10%, but I'm not going to complain about this. I am very happy that they can be. This is the only tree that gets so small, and it's just about perfect because it's also the one tree that I really need for this alpine theme, and the rest of the foliage I can do with the shrubbery. And thankfully the shrubs are mostly small enough to scale them down to 50% and they fit into the model size. So I put some topiaries as bushes and some other ground shrubbery around it to get the feel that there's some nature in here. I think they could even look like actual foliage. One thing that surprised me when I went to Legoland Billund a couple weeks ago is that the foliage in Legoland is real. And I don't mean the trees around the park, but in the Miniland section where they have showcases of all places around Denmark and the world made out of Lego, and it's this kind of miniature world showcase, there are tiny trees that are actually made out of trees that they prune and keep small somehow, which is really cool. I thought that was one of the really nice touches about that entire area. And I think that given the size of this build, it probably could be the case here too. I'm not sure if one could keep these trees as small as they are, and it's probably easier to have all of this foliage just be fake. But yeah, there's something nice about having it be real foliage as well. Don't know if that is quite possible. Let me know your thoughts on that if you happen to be an expert on these things, but it seems like it's reasonably doable. One of my main concerns here is how people would get into the faraway pieces of this model to fix and repair things, because this model is decently big and it doesn't have any obvious places where people could walk, so I'm not sure if some trees need watering, or if some houses need fixing, or if a train needs unstucking somewhere in the middle of this model, how people would get to that area. The only reason I'm not too concerned about this is that I also have no idea how they do this in Miniatur Wunderland. Some of the scenes over there are absolutely huge, and there is no way that one could walk into that model and get to some places and repair some small things without the intervention of cranes or whatever kind of sorcery they are using to keep that whole place up. So maybe I shouldn't be too concerned about these things and I'm overthinking things, but generally I'm pretty good at that, so it is what it is. Also, that juniper tree over there is also a great little foliage tip. If you ever want to do something like this yourself, definitely check out the juniper trees, because there are some very small variations in there, which, if you scale them down, fits right in with the small pine trees that I have here, as well as the shrubbery. Now this part just ended up being a place which is perfectly suited for a lighthouse. And I didn't really plan this, I just put rocks in a way that made sense, but I ended up with this plateau over here, which was just, for some reason it felt like I really had to build a lighthouse here. It felt like just the right thing to do. and I'm trying to keep this also as simple as possible, but thankfully I can build most of this thing out of the infinitely scalable metal beam pieces, which are just amazing for this build in general. So it's kind of funny to realize that this lighthouse is made out of the same pieces that the locomotive of the train is made out of, except in this case they're often even scaled up, but the difference in size is ridiculous. What's also funny is that this lighthouse is made out of pieces that are all kind of in the middle of their scaling, so you could actually scale this lighthouse up to an almost realistic size as well. Not quite a tall building, but it could definitely be a lighthouse at the end of a small pier somewhere in a port if you're just working on a realistic scale, if you scale this thing up as much as you can. So I kind of found that funny as well. Then I added this little this little house right next to it, which is, I guess, where the lighthouse keeper would live. I recently watched the movie The Lighthouse with Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. I'm not going to talk any more about that because that was an amazing movie, but I was also terrified in general. But if you're into horror films and you haven't seen it yet, here's my random recommendation to watch The Lighthouse. It's not as wholesome as this little model railway build, but it is really good. Also, I decided to add a little station for the lighthouse because there's obviously no roads leading to it, so probably one would need to use the train to get to this faraway lighthouse location. So there's a little station just for the lighthouse. This is also where I started experimenting with adding a rail to the bridge, but then I quickly realized there's no way to do that without getting into lots of pieces, because I would have to custom make it using the metal posts, and that would just not fit into my piece count. So, alas, the bridge stays relatively simple. It is what it is. I really can't afford to go over 4,000 pieces just for a little railing or fence on the bridge there. What I was willing to splurge some pieces on though is a castle in the middle of this build, which is kind of my weenie for this build. And it's mostly made out of some stone pieces that are made out of a wall set, and which kind of perfectly work for this sort of thing. And then most of the roofs will be made out of basic pieces, because there's no other way to make spires without using too many pieces. I did find this mythology planter piece very useful to create the shape of a castle turret. Eventually I did replace it with some other planter pieces, but in general that whole set of planter stuff is pretty useful for the kind of thing that I was going for here. And then our roof is made out of a small few cubes. In general, I think the basic art shapes are very useful for this kind of miniature build as well, because they're quite small in and of themselves, but you can also scale them down to 20%. So whenever I was looking for a specific piece or shape and I couldn't find a very small piece for it, the basic shapes usually came to the rescue. This also goes for the roofs, by the way. All of the roofs in this build are made out of basic shape rectangles, just to make sure that I can use as few pieces as possible for those roofs. And then if we take those little turrets for instance, they're just a small post and then a cone basic piece. But you know, from a distance it looks castle-esque enough, and with a few rain gutter windows again, I think it looks believably like a building, at least enough to function here. And then of course we have our main tower, our tallest boy in this entire castle, which needs a slightly special turret as well, or a spire I should say. So here's my kind of wonky spire for the tallest tower, and then I used some small post pieces to give every spire a small finial on top of it as well. And that is mostly it for this castle. I kept kind of looking back at it from a distance. Unfortunately that ends up in a lot of camera movements, so I'm sorry for this part of the time-lapse being a bit more wonky and a bit more difficult to look at. But I really wanted to figure out how this castle could look decent from all kinds of angles. and that goes for all of the rockwork on this build as well. So yeah, I just couldn't stop myself from doing the painter kind of thing, where you take a step back, look at it from a distance, and get a feel for whether it works or not. Eventually, I think we ended up with a shape that looks good enough from all angles, like a little weenie on top of the mountain, that I'm happy with the overall direction that this castle went into. Ooh, but now we get to a very fun part of this build. This is going to be a slightly scuffed cable car. And I was just super hyped when I figured out that the horizontal moving platform is just the right length in this miniature build to bring a cable car from the bottom to the top of the mountain, which is absolutely amazing. And I was just so hyped and so happy that you can't imagine my shock when I turned that animation piece to animation speed slow, and I'm looking at that thing going in absolutely ridiculously high speed from one side to the other. I think this is around the part in the time-lapse where I was having this realization. I ended up going through with my plan because, well, I started it, and the distance is just too good not to do it. Plus, what's a model railway without a little ski lift? It's something that you practically just have to put in there. But it is a bit sad that it's just a bit too not so slow. Which I also can't blame the developers for too much, because it's partly just because this is a miniature build. So any speed that anything has at a realistic scale just gets upped to a ridiculous speed in real life. That wooden coaster, which is controlling the train, is crawling at a ridiculous snail's pace. Somewhere down deep in the ground. So it kind of makes sense that the speed isn't exactly what I was hoping it to be, but it's still too much fun to see this thing go around and going back and forth. And it's a relatively simple ski lift, but I think that's also what you tend to see on these kinds of model railways. Don't want to go over the top with some kind of Doppelmayr gondola of a specific type. We're just gonna go with an aerial tram, which this is technically, that goes back and forth and is relatively simple. Now this is one of the highest parts of this build, so I wanted to put some houses on this hill here to make it seem like we have what they call in German an Alm. It's a meadow somewhere in the mountains, and typically you see these mountain houses on here which have large overhanging roofs with giant and sometimes decorated eaves and really large balconies, sometimes going all around the building. So that's what I built over here. We have a balcony fence made out of a vent, which was one of my favorite findings, I think, overall in this build. And, you know, some of these decoration choices might seem really creative, but really this was just me going back to my little blueprint of all the small pieces in the game and trying to see which piece best suited the goal that I was looking for. So, as an overall tip, if you're trying to do this kind of thing, or just trying to detail on a regular scale, place down some of the items that you think you might be using throughout your build or might fit together, and look back at them sometimes, because it's a lot easier than scrolling through the menu and trying to see which pieces could work for whatever reason. I don't think I would have been able to come up with the vent balcony fence if it weren't for the fact that I put that thing down somewhere just to get an idea of which pieces in the game could work for this very small scale. And sometimes I also ended up using some very large pieces in this build, or even scaling pieces up, which is the case for this ramp where the railway goes up to the second level, because I wanted to keep this as clean as possible, but I was looking for a piece that kind of looked like large concrete plates poured into a location, and I think that piece just about does the trick. So that was pretty neat. And then over here we have another corner, and I wanted to make sure that every corner has something of interest. So on one corner we have the town next to the railway station, in the other corner we have the lighthouse, And in the other corner we have the aerial tram making its way up the mountain. So in this corner we have this little house with a pier and some steps down to the house from the station. And in my mind I also envisioned some kind of small boat in the water there, which also doesn't fit into the piece count, so I had to skip that idea. But I did settle for some rock work along the coast here, and I think with these darker rocks combined with the mossy rocks just making up the overall ground, and also the fake water scenery item, which is perfect for this kind of thing, we actually end up with some realistic-ish looking terraforming and terrain. So yeah, pretty happy with the combination of these pieces and how they work together. I haven't seen many people use these water pieces as actual water. So many people are using them to make windows because we don't have glass yet in the game. It's coming in the December update. But I haven't seen many people use them for their actual intended purposes. So that's what I'm doing here. Now, here's my final way of making a reference to Jägerhorn, which is to build the church from Jägerhorn in miniature version right here. So I pulled up some images of what Jägerhorn looked like and tried rebuilding this thing in a simplified form with as few pieces as possible, but really taking that shape and the colors and bringing it back into this build here. So there's a fun little Easter egg, I suppose. Plus, I also figured we can't have a mountain village miniature without having one of those iconic mountain village churches with their Baroque spires and onion domes. So that's what we have here to really finish up the theme. By the way, this seems like a good opportunity to flex for no reason at all that I've remade the Jägerhorn church in Lego a few years ago using the custom Lego creation and Bricklink, which was really fun. If anybody's interested in seeing the making of that, I could put that up somewhere on my second channel or so, because I just realized I made that whole thing and then never actually did anything with it. But yeah, now it's somewhere in my room and I look at it every day. So this is still, I think, out of all of the stuff that I've done in Planet Coaster, the build that is closest to my heart, clearly. Now, finally, I had one more idea that I wanted to try, because at this point I thought the build was finished and I didn't want to add anything else, plus I was already at 4,000 pieces. But then I had the idea that these people on this town are kind of cut off from the road, and I could probably make a simple crossing. So I deleted some bushes very selectively to get some more pieces of space, and I decided to make a custom railway crossing. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't really work so well. You can see me here struggling to make a traffic light for this, and I eventually opted not to go for it because I didn't quite have the right pieces. But then I did want to build this crossing element just because I figured you could actually build it and animate it. And you can, but the one problem is you can't control how long these things stay up. So eventually I had to turn this thing off, because even if I timed it with the train would arrive, they would close, and then when the first wagon is barely past, they'll already open again. So I really hope that at some point in the future Frontier might give us extra controls over some of the animation pieces, because this is also holding back the ability to make custom doors for coasters, for instance. But who knows? Overall, I'm really happy with the animation pieces, and you can do great things with them, don't get me wrong. But there are some things that are just slightly off the mark, or they could be more flexible with just a small change here and there. It was fun to build these things though, and to see them work and see them in action, but eventually I deactivated them because there's no way that this would look realistic enough, and I'd rather have them just be stationary than opening and closing at slightly weird times. Anyway, that's it for my time-lapse, so let's check out what the build looks like in game. Ah, now look at our little baby train here. And I think from a distance and from the side, and probably the perspective that people will be looking at it from. It's pretty realistic, and it's mostly following the track as it should be. Every now and then I find myself trying to click the tracks to get the train, which doesn't work, but you can actually click on the train and it'll select the wooden coaster right underneath it, which is called the Jägeralm Express, of course. But overall, it's pretty fun to watch this thing go around. So here we have the station on the other side, called the Nordhang Bahnhof, as the train departs from the platform there. And then we have our little Jägerhorn church, as well as the aerial tramway there, which is not as slow as the moving platform might suggest, but I think it's about doable. And, you know, realistically, some of these model railways don't quite have realistic speeds for their cable cars and such, so I think it's fine. And then we are pulling up to Jägeralm Bahnhof, which is our main train station here. And that's where our train basically finishes. It's around the entire trek. And we have another train on the other side, which is basically in the game sitting on some block brakes. But it helps to have these two trains in the stations at the same time, so they can both do each half of the layout at once. And yeah, that's basically all there is to it. And here's our view of the castle from a distance. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how it looks from all the different angles that you can look at this from, even though I think it is pretty clear that this was my main interest and my main perspective to look at it from. And here's our guest to give you an idea of what the scale of this is. It's quite big, but similar to Miniland and other kinds of outdoor miniature worlds. If you want to give this blueprint a try and look at it yourself, or maybe even pick it apart and build your own model railway, I'll share a blueprint code in the description, so you can open it in the game for yourself. And you can also separately select the tracks and take some pieces out of that. Or of course, take the wooden coaster and use it to create your own animated train. With that said, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next adventure. Take care, everyone.